Hello and welcome to another episode of Statford Bridge, Chelsea by the Numbers. Uh, I wasn't going to record a podcast, and then I decided, I had good conversations with people on Twitter about this, and I decided, let's do a podcast. Why not? It'll be cathartic. Chelsea lost 1-0 away to Arsenal in a game that they were wildly not dangerous until, I don't know, I thought they were pretty good the last 15, 20 minutes in terms of hemming Arsenal in. But it was very much a frustrating game for people to watch, especially in the way that Chelsea lost it, in that neither did they give Arsenal particularly anything good, but they especially created nothing. 8 shots, zero point 0.4 xG. They were at a box touch, negative differential for one of the few games that has happened this season, 27-10. And it's kind of the trend of the last little while that Chelsea have had a really, really hard time creating things. Cole Palmer is kind of in a rut. Jackson has been out. Madueke has been out. And across the two Copenhagen games, Arsenal and Leicester, this has been a Chelsea team that just hasn't created very much. And when you look at the course of the season, Chelsea have been very prolific as an attacking team. After the match, Mikel Arteta said, Chelsea, by all the metrics, are the best attacking team in the league. When I look, I see the same thing, or something to that effect. And I think it is both broadly true that Chelsea have attacked well en masse for the season, and they have been very poor in the last little stretch. If we look at the sexy spreadsheet, Arsenal 0.4, Leicester 1. In between those are like a Copenhagen 0.5 and a Copenhagen 1. Southampton 2.3, you don't get any points for that. 2.3 Villa, 0.5 Brighton. It's just not a lot. There's just not that much there. And we have seen a real change in what Chelsea have looked like, right? Like if you look at the rolling expected goals numbers, they're very poor in the last kind of 6 weeks or so. Again, very strong first half of the season. Little blip, decent recovery, pretty poor again. Chelsea Youth pulled up to McClockbot radars to compare up to December 30th and then into the new year. And on the face of it, they don't look that different, right? 1.74 non-penalty expected goals, 1.66, not that different. 1.16 non-penalty expected goals against, 1.07. Like small declines, but not huge. Even if you wanted to be a real positive person, you'd say, look, 0 non-penalty expected goal difference in the first half of the season plus 0.07. I think this is a real thing, right? Like Chelsea have gotten much better at set pieces. But I think the 2 or 3 metrics that I really want to focus on, if you look at the first half of the season, Chelsea 0.112 non-penalty expected goals per shot. That's really high. I said this at the beginning of the season. Chelsea were like 0.14, that it was unsustainably high, but that it would be a really nice thing if they were able to keep that level of shot quality and get the shot volume above 15. And they did for a big stretch of the season. But what we've seen is progressively the shot volume has continued to increase and the quality has declined significantly, right? If I go back and look, outside the box, outside the box, outside the box, outside the box, header, blocked, kind of a knockdown. Like not great shot quality. If I go look at the Copenhagen game, like really poor shot quality. If I go look at Leicester, and again, go look at the shots. And Leicester was a game where Chelsea took lots of shots. Not great shot quality in there. So when we're talking about these things, like that's a thing I get really stuck on, is the shot quality has declined significantly. And 0.112 to 0.097 might not seem like a lot, but that is if you think about that across 15 shots a game, like that's 0.3 xG. Like that's like a not a not trivial number. And again, some of that is taken away because they're taking an extra shot and a half and blah, 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 blah. But like that matters. And the second thing that I really want to focus on is the big chances created, going from 1.5 to 1.1. So big chances are a subjective flag applied by Opta and by other data providers that the person who is coding the game sees something about this shot that is like, yeah, it's a big chance, like they should score, or it's, oh my God, that's a great chance, and it gets flagged. The average XG of a big chance is about 0.4. The conversion rate of a big chance is about 40%. So if you think that every 2 games, Chelsea are creating 3 chances that are like 0.4 or higher, basically, that's kind of your, really like 0.25 or higher. Think about it that way. And all of a sudden, they're getting 1 a game. It's a big drop-off. That's like, those are the chances you score, right? And I think that really lines up with how Chelsea fans feel, and at least how I feel watching the last couple games is like, hey, yeah, Chelsea are getting their shots off, but like, when did you think Chelsea were going to score against Arsenal? Right? Even the Leicester match, which I talked about before, even the Leicester match, you go, look, Chelsea won 1-0, they miss a penalty, but like the Cucurella goal is not a big chance. Like where to me, where's the big chance that other than the penalty, you're like, oh man, Chelsea should score? It's like maybe one Cole Palmer one, if I remember correctly. Like that's kind of it. Other than that, it's not a whole lot of stuff that you're like, oh my God, that's such a good chance. I can't believe they didn't score. And so what I wanted to talk about is, I don't really want to talk about Arsenal. I do want to talk about how Chelsea can do that better, basically. So against Arsenal, as I say, I don't want to talk about Arsenal. And I think truly for the whole season, Enzo Maresca has done a really, really good job of seeing, this is how the opposition are pressing us. This is my solve to break the press. I think he has been really, really, really good at that. If you look at some of the metrics, we have things like build completion. The Mark Stats website is excellent. You can look at this. If you look at build completion, Chelsea are second in the league behind only Manchester City in the number of builds that they get under pressure from their half into the attacking half under possession. That's really good. That's a really, really good thing. And they get pressed significantly more than someone like Man City. So, like, really nice. I think Maresca has had very good solutions to the build, which is not surprising. This is one of the things that I think, looking at his Leicester time, we thought would be pretty good. So, for example, Arsenal play like a hybrid press 4-4-2. It's man-to-man in some places. It's zonal in some places. Particularly, their main thing. Don't worry about the names. I was too lazy to change the names. Again, and before I go into this segment, as it were, like, if you are listening only, you're going to miss out here because you can't see the tactics board. But this is going to be very tactics board heavy. So if you're watching, great. If you're listening, less great. But I'll do my best to be descriptive. Arsenal set up in like this zonal man-to-man hybrid press. It's a 4-4-2. One of the wingers is kind of high. It's really set up to... It's less about generating really good turnovers and more as a defensive tactic, right? One of the things I said somewhat flippantly after the game was that like Chelsea went into Arsenal away, the best defensive team in Europe, without their 3 best attackers and didn't create very much. What a shock. Move on with your life, which is partially true. Like, Arsenal are a genuinely excellent defensive team. But again, I think like if Chelsea have legitimate ambitions to do anything, like you have to be able to do more than that. And the way Arsenal press is primarily a defensive tactic. Other teams, say Bournemouth, the way they press is primarily an attacking tactic. Like they are, if you look at the number of opposition high possession losses, Arsenal are getting the second most behind Bournemouth, who are 31. Like they are very much looking to turn you over for danger for themselves to create, whereas Arsenal are much more about denying your ability to create good things. And what we saw primarily from Arsenal was pressure on the center back right away, from their front two in the press or the winger. They were very, very, very disciplined about not letting Chelsea set up their builds and not letting them rotate fullbacks high and not letting them get everybody set up to build. And when the ball would go wide, particularly to the left, towards Levi Colwill or Benoit Badiashile, Martin Odegaard would pop off of the 6 and really, really aggressively close down, and Arsenal would super, super jam the whole side of the pitch that Chelsea were building on and make it very, very difficult to get out. And particularly because Odegaard is sprinting at you and their jumps into midfield are really good, so you don't have easy passes. You end up having to play the winger's feed, or you end up having to play long balls to Pedro Neto, and it's difficult. Like, it's a very bad situation to build in. What we saw in the second half was instead Chelsea's back three built super wide, like crazy wide. And so now when Colwill plays to Badiashile and he's now 5 to 10 yards wider, that distance for Odegaard to get there is way more difficult. So now he has much more ability to play into the next line, to play ground passes, to take his time, to play feet. And just that little tweak made all of Arsenal's presses much more difficult to enact. And now all of a sudden Odegaard's like, I'm not going to get there. So he chills. And now Chelsea are able to access the next line. And all of a sudden you end up in situations like this where Chelsea have the ball in the attacking half, settled possession against the packed block. If you look at the possession versus time graph from Chelsea Arsenal, in the first half, possession was 55-45 Chelsea. At the 30-minute mark, it was 55-45 Arsenal. So from 30 minutes on, Chelsea go all the way up to 55-45, and then in the second half, they go 63-37. Chelsea had all the ball in the second half. They did a really, really, really good job of breaking Arsenal down, denying their ability to turn them over in the first third, and getting into the attacking half. And Pep used to have this quote about, like, I'll get you to the final third and then it's your thing. Tuchel was very similar. And I think the quality of final third entries that Chelsea get under Maresca is actually very low compared to people like that. Like, they will stably and reliably get to the final third, but I think they very often arrive in situations like this where it is very much a packed block and it is difficult to break teams down when they defend deep and organized and they're good at it. It's harder. It is objectively harder. And I think that's one of the things where in the first half of the season, people talked about Chelsea playing on the counter, but a lot of it was like possessions to generate quick attacks. And I think that has very much gone out of the game, that it is a more stable entry to the final third, but fewer quick attacks. And if we think about the Arsenal game, Chelsea end up in a situation that has looked very familiar at multiple points this season. We saw this against Copenhagen. We saw this against Brentford in the second half. We've seen this multiple times. That a team either plays a back four or a back five. They get into the final third. Their winger tracks the winger. The fullback tracks whoever is in the 10 spot. And all of a sudden, it's like a pretty man-to-man 5v5 on the last line. Right? We've seen this all the time. The winger tracks. Brighton did the same thing with Minte. It happens over and over and over again. What Enzo Maresca's solution in general has been is, okay, I'm going to put another player on the last line. And now we're going to be 6v5, and now you have to choose. And in theory, like at its very, very basis, this works, right? Like, you get an extra number. You end up in a wide spot. If Jackson comes over to join with Cucurella and Sancho, like I have in this diagram, but again, doesn't matter the names. And then Palmer comes, and then they shrink the back four, and then Enzo comes, they shrink the back four. Either you break them down here, or you have narrowed them enough such that when you swing, you get the free player on the opposite side, and you can do whatever you want. Right? Like that is the theory of you get +1, they cannot mark all of you. And then, like, oh, if they flatten the other winger and now it's 6, well, now it's very easy to get central box entries because you've ruined their density. But this requires two things. One, these 4 players who are loading the last line of your 6, they have to actually make the defenders defend. And one of the things that we have ended up with a lot of the time is that actually none of these players, when it's Pedro Neto instead of Jackson, want to attack the box. Because the ball will go wide to Sancho, and Christopher Nkunku will show outside of the structure. And Pedro Neto will show outside of the structure. And Cole Palmer will show outside of the structure. And maybe Enzo Fernandez will crash. And the opposite winger will stay all the way out. And all of a sudden, actually, your 6 on the last line is really just 1 on the last line. And so I think one of the really, really critical things, and I don't have a tremendous number of suggestions, I'm not a Premier League head coach, are that Chelsea have to find a way to actually generate box pressure and depth pressure with the personnel they have. Listen, I understand that if your wingers are Christopher Nkunku, who cannot run anymore, like it is very apparent that he cannot sprint into depth. He is physically a shell of the man he was. And Sancho is one of your wingers who cannot sprint. You have to find alternative ways to get into depth. I think one of those ways is to play Tyreek George because he's actually quite an active off-ball runner. I think one of the other things that we saw in the games that it has worked well with Neto as the 9 is that Neto becomes a very common depth presence, right? Like if you look at the Southampton game, where Chelsea looked quite good, Neto is constantly running into depth, and it was very effective in that game. So, to me, the number one is like, how do you actually generate box pressure beyond, with off-ball movement, beyond just like, I'm going to stick 6 players on the last line. Because I think that's great and that's fine, but those players have to actually apply pressure from those situations. I think the second thing that comes into this is Chelsea's wide breakdown play. So their ability for their wingers to create high quality chances is exceptionally reliant on 1v1 dribbling ability. This is one of the things I think Maresca has been very loath to reference Pep in his development and the choices he makes and all that. He's spoke about Manuel Pellegrini, for example, much more frequently. This is a Pep thing, that by making your primary box entry method be 1v1 winger dribbles, it has two advantages. One, successful 1v1 dribbles to box entries are really good because all of a sudden you end up with Jadon Sancho in like the perfect assist zone for cutbacks and squares and all those sorts of things. Those are really, really great. The other is that if you turn the ball over here, this is an extremely not dangerous situation. You can counterpress really well. It's wide and it's deep. It's very easy for the weak side players to recover for transitions. It's like a very safe method of box entries. It's also not super effective if your wingers aren't excellent 1v1 dribblers. Jadon Sancho, very technically gifted guy, but he's not very athletically gifted. There are very few fullbacks that Jadon Sancho goes past. The other is that it is exceptionally reliant, again, on the prior method that we just talked about. You have to get the bodies into the box so that if you do beat them, you have a 9 and a 10 and another 10 and a weak side winger filling all of the spaces for squares and for cutbacks and for overhit crosses, where the few times Chelsea have done that in their matches of late, like there is a chance for Marc Cucurella at the end where they're able to get a 9 in Neto showing for the cutback. Marc Cucurella arrives at the back post. Christopher Nkunku is behind him. And they're actually able to get like a reasonable Cucurella chance at the end out of it. If you look at some of the other games that have come from, or some of the other goals that have come from the similar situations, right? Like Marc Cucurella's goal against Southampton, like these are all, you get winger or slip run into the channel and you get numbers into the box to score. Like that is the method. And to bring it back to what I was talking about, if your wingers are not able to reliably get you into the final third, into the box rather, like Jadon Sancho and Christopher Nkunku are just not athletically talented enough to go past fullbacks in that way. And really, none of Chelsea's fullbacks beyond Mykhailo Mudryk and Noni Madueke, which is like a crazy thing to say. Tyreek George has not. I think he's been a useful player, but has absolutely not shown the 1v1 ability to consistently get into the box. He is very often bodied off by fullbacks and has really struggled. And I think that's why he's looked much better as a 9, threatening depth, than he has as a winger. You need to have like associative play or collaborative play between your winger and your 10 and your 9 or whoever it is. And one of the things that we have seen Chelsea struggle with over and over and over and over and over again is that, again, this is very tactic sport heavy, but the winger gets the ball, the 10, who in this case is Cucurella, but it could be Enzo, it could be Palmer, makes the channel run, and that is the only action. And what happens is this player tracks, or they pass him off, or he gets picked up, or they say, okay, we've held our offside line, it's fine. And that's the end of the action. And all of a sudden, okay, we go back to Colwill, we might go around, we might stay here, and there's no secondary action, there's no secondary movement. If you watch Arsenal, and I don't want this to be like, oh my God, Arsenal are so good, why don't Chelsea play like Arsenal? But like Arsenal's wide breakdown stuff, if you watch Arsenal chasing a game, they are relentless with their movement in wide areas where, let's say you end up in a situation where you have a fullback and a winger doubled up against the winger. You have a midfielder inside to protect anything coming inside, right? Like not an easy situation to break down. The action you will see repeatedly from Arsenal is the 10 or the fullback or whoever it is will break the line on the underlap or break the line on the overlap. They'll go, and the first time the defending team picks it up and they manage no problem. The winger will drive inside, nothing opens up, and they'll play back to their safety pass. And what happens with Chelsea is that same action will happen, and this player will now, okay, I'm coming back outside, and you'll come back here, and by the time we get it, they're all set to defend it again. What happens with Arsenal is Cucurella breaks the line, Sancho dribbles inside, it's not here for me, I go back to Cucurella. Well, now, Cucurella recycles his run into the wide spot, the winger is now inside, and now the exact same actions are going to happen again. I'm going to dribble inside, Sancho's going to break the line, and now maybe they don't pick it up this time, because it's a winger, not a 10, and all their responsibilities are different. And maybe it comes off, and maybe it doesn't. And again, I dribble inside, but now you also have, maybe the 9 makes a slip run, or maybe the opposite 10 has popped into this pocket, and there's all these secondary movements associated with it, and maybe none of those come off, and all of a sudden, again, Sancho recycles his run, Cucurella fills in, and now Jackson makes this movement. And the exact same situation happens again. And they just recycle and recycle and recycle. And it's like a blender where they just rotate their spots. And it's not complicated. It's the same action basically every time of winger, widest player, dribbles inside. They either get an overlap or an underlap. They either play the pass for the overlap or they drive inside to create for themselves. If none of those open, they play back to the reset pass and they reset the action. And they do it again. And they do that fast. They do it quickly and they do it fast. And it works really well. You watch Arsenal chase late in games and they rip fullbacks apart when everyone's fit. When they're limited, okay, they have problems. But like this is something Chelsea could do in the final third. It is purely the intensity of off-ball movement. And so when I look at what can Chelsea do to not be this team where the attack just goes down, 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 down. When I look at that and say, okay, how do you fix this attack? Those are the two things that I look at the most. Is how can you increase the box pressure and the depth pressure with the talent you have available? I think Neto going as a 9 was a pretty clever solution. I didn't think it would work. CFC Central Sam thought it was a great idea. It's worked much better than I anticipated. But you have to actually play like that. You have to apply pressure and depth, and it can't just be him. And then in the final third, how are you applying box pressure? Like, the number of times Chelsea got into advantageous final third positions and have 0 players in the box is unbelievable. And the second half is in wide areas. You need to be much more disciplined about breaking teams down. Sam and I had a conversation on Twitter about, he said, like, I don't think this attack is good. And I'm like, reconcile that with the fact that the metrics are really strong over the season. And the point he made was like, I do not think long term it is sustainable to get the amount of production that the attack needs out of the wide players with the underlaps and overlaps that this squad generates. Which is to say, like, very low quality ones, because the players are often Cole Palmer on his right foot, which is not a super good situation, or Mark Cucurella, who's just like not that good. I think one of the things that I would personally love to see Chelsea as a solution is in the final third, if you're going to have Reece James play as a midfielder, is to have Reece James be that player. Instead of having him sit on the edge as transition opportunities, that's like not his strength. Reece isn't a terrific transition defender. Use him in the combination with your wide player, whether it's underlapping or it's overlapping, and let him do the fullback things, the things that he is so good at as a player, the crossing in the final third, the passing in the final third. Let him do that, and he doesn't have to get up and down because his recovery isn't here. His recovery is here. Right? And again, I'm trying for audio listeners, that's his recovery is into midfield. It's not to fullback. Like, the distances are shorter. It's the same reason why from right back, Enzo Maresca likes the fullback to go into midfield, is because the recovery distances are shorter from midfield to fullback spaces than they are from fullback to winger spaces. And so if you think about this the same way, if Reece James gets high and wide, or Reece James makes the channel run, right? Like, Malo Gusto, for his many faults, is actually, his off-ball movement is quite good at that. Let him make that movement, and then your fullback covers, especially when he's playing as a midfielder. So, I mean, that's a very long way to say, like, the attack is not very fun to watch, but I think there's some interesting ideas there that can fix some things. And, you know, Chelsea have it in an international break. They don't play until March 8th, I think, is their next match against Spurs. Is it March 8th? April 3rd, sorry. I've got everything mixed up. So I'll be very, very curious to see. I'll be very curious to see how this goes. Mostly everyone will be around. No Caicedo, no Enzo. Reece James is going to England. Cole Palmer is injured with a hamstring problem. We'll see how real that is. But I'll be very, very curious to see where Chelsea, off the back of an international break against a very ailing Spurs, look in terms of the attack, because Chelsea are in 4th on 49 points. They're 1 clear of City. They're 2 clear of Newcastle, have a game in hand. Got to put points on the board. I think 64 will do it, but you got to put them on the board. No episode next week, international break. I'll be in LA for Nations League. Who knows? We'll see what. Maybe I'll come back with Jonathan David propaganda of some denomination. Other interesting Chelsea things that have happened. They signed Giovanni Kenda and Dario Asugo from Sporting Lisbon. Asugo is interesting to me. Like, he looks very Caicedo regen-y. He moves very similarly. His stat profile is very similar. Huge ball winning, good enough passing. I think that's a good profile selection. I think the team is very lacking in a secondary ball winner. I think when you're talking about midfield rooms for Champions League, Lavia, Asugo, Caicedo, Andre Santos, Enzo Fernandez is probably a bit light on passing, but I think is a pretty interesting group to work with. It actually screams very 4-3-3, Cole Palmer playing as a right winger to me. Like, you could have some pretty fantastic big game midfields of like Caicedo with pick two of Andreas Sugo and Caicedo and Enzo Fernandez. Like, you got a lot of movement and a lot of ball winning there. And then Kenda, like, I don't know, my Sporting friends love him. United people seemed pretty mad, but also we're spending 50 million on a wingback when we don't play with wingbacks, and he's a winger who doesn't score that much. Don't really see the vision on that one. I don't see the vision on a lot of the recruitment, which I need to caveat that the recruitment always sucks. But we'll see. Anyways, that'll be all for me. We'll be back, I don't know, after Spurs probably at some point. As always, enjoy the soccer.